I define soft power as a country's ability to attract and persuade other nations through cultural outreach without the use of coercion. My interest in soft power began last spring when I was working with a Russian tutor to begin learning the language and practicing my pronunciation. During this time, I was introduced to many different forms of Russian culture through many videos and different photos and images and all types of cultural outreach. This was my first introduction to soft power. Then this past summer, I attended One World's Now summer program. And in that program, we visited a Russian church. This was the time when, in the news, Putin, as well as Russia, was being characterized as bad, and everything you would see about Russia was always negative. Upon visiting this Russian Eastern European Orthodox church, I noticed that they had deliberately chosen for their constituents to not discuss the war in Ukraine because they wanted to welcome all people to their organization, no matter their nationality or the current political state. This is where my true interest started because although this organization, the Russian Eastern Orthodox Church, has connections with the Russian government, and in other branches, there are many places where it is directly facilitated through the Russian government. This one was not. And so I wanted to see how different organizations could both be authentic sources of cultural connection, as well as being facilitated and partially funded and paid for by the Russian government and other governments. So this started the journey to making SPEF, or the Soft Power Evaluation Framework. And first, we're going to look at this dashboard. So here we have an average score of authenticity across the categories. We have a number of countries that have been recorded in this framework, and we have the total number of cases that have been recorded so far. And we also have a highlight of the amount of high-risk cases, which have a score below 25, which are, when we look at our chart, we see that that would be any organizations that receive a level of sharp power or coercive power. And the reason why there are many colors is to help facilitate the understanding of a person and follow each of the levels very clearly throughout the website. Next, we're going to look at the case library. On this case library, we have a multitude of different cases, which are all organizations that have been measured at different levels of authenticity. We have authentic, which will be the International Student Exchange Program, and that is a representation of programs that are one student to another student. Oftentimes it's the most direct forms of communication that are the most authentic because when it's a person to person, they're interacting with another person. Whereas if they're interacting with an organization, there's often a motive behind the interaction. Now, next we have a specific example of the Sister Cities International, Pskov and Roanoke between Russia and the US. And this one has received a level of facilitated, which means that the government has some influence in both of these programs. However, it is still a very authentic mode of communication. And this is very important because when looking at an organization, there are many people who would see it as one way or another. Black and white thinking is the common term. So most people would look at this and say, there's one that's authentic and there's one that's coercive. But that's the goal of the soft power evaluation framework is to shift people's mindset into thinking that there are benefits to things that might have some coercion in them, but they are still very beneficial for others. Now we are going to look at the soft power evaluation calculator, which is how all the ratings are made. Within this calculator, you are able to add a case name, the country that this organization is coming from, the actor type, which is from what level of government the organization is coming from, a description to keep track of what the organization does and what it's about, and some key features to make yourself a quick highlight sheet of what is important about this organization. Now, this is the most important part. This is how the scores are calculated so that you can see what level of authenticity the organization has received. Now, this part is still under construction as it is very important, and I am working to develop specific levels of scores so that we can very easily identify what level any organization we are looking at is. So the parts that go into the score is the authenticity index, the communication and transparency of an organization, the institutional independence. And that is really important as it's whether an organization is directly connected to the government or whether it's separate or whether it receives some government funding. And all of those have different scores which go into the calculation of an organization's authenticity, as well as the scale and reach. So how big of an organization it is and how many people this is going out to. And finally, the impact and effectiveness, because there is an important part of this, which is how it connects others. That's mainly what these cultural organizations are trying to do. One thing about soft power is that it's very subject to interpretation. Why this framework is so important is because instead of looking at the qualitative data, which would be the case studies and people's research and books and papers, this would be a way to look at quantitative data to directly compare it numerically based on these different factors, which would then be calculated at specific levels so that all organizations would be graded at the same levels so that we could directly compare them. Now, when looking at the SPEF dimensions guide, this is really to help a person understand what score that they are going to be putting into the calculator. Each part of this will have a assigned number of points, and then upon adding up the points, you will be able to put a specific score into the SPEF calculator, which will then help you make your final assessment of the authenticity of an organization. And the way this works is that we use the website's capabilities to take the score, multiply it by the percentage of impact that that specific score has on the authenticity and see what it comes up to, and then look at the rating in comparison to the levels of authenticity. Now, this is another important part of the SPEF, and this is to look at a side-by-side comparison of specific case studies. So if you were to enter two different organizations into the SPEF calculator, and then you were to take those organizations and you wanted to look directly at them, directly side by side with quantitative data, you could do that by putting both of the cases into the compare cases part, and then you could see their levels of authenticity, their levels of communication, their levels of independence, their levels of scale, and their levels of impact directly next to each other. So that would allow you to think about different levels of the different sections of it. So when we are looking at this, you can look at both the categories that go into the actual rating for authenticity, and then above all, you can look at the authenticity itself, which you can see is still categorized, and all of it is still color coded with direct coloring to clearly mark out which organization the data is coming from. And finally, we have our framework guide, which will be able to direct people on how to use this resource. Developed after my class on social entrepreneurship, this was one of the suggestions for how to create a web-based app. So I utilized it to develop this framework so that people would be easily able to look at quantitative data directly comparing organizations. Thank you so much for listening and have a good evening.